What interests me about religion as a skeptic are the claims. I'm not interested in anything else about religion, all the doctrine, all the guides on how to live your life, etc., etc. All I'm interested in are the claims. So far on my channel, I've been mainly focusing on the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, monotheism. So I want to branch out a bit and look at other religions. Buddhism. What about Buddhism? Well, I believed for some time that Buddhism was the atheist religion because there's no God, right? Well, no. In this video, we have here a man who is a secular Buddhist, and he's going to be talking about this question about the relationship between atheism and Buddhism. Are there any gods in Buddhism? If so, what is the evidence? Let's have a listen to what he's got to say, and I'll comment where appropriate.
Here, I discussed the Kevada Sutta, which is a very, very famous sutta where the Buddha describes a kind of situation that involves Brahma, that is the chief of the gods for the Brahmanic religion. In this sutta, he basically creates a kind of a satire where Brahma comes across as an ignorant blowhard, basically. So Brahma talks in very high terms about himself, but when push comes to shove, it's clear Brahma really doesn't know nearly as much as you might think he does. So that's one way that the Buddha approaches the notion of gods having greater knowledge than humans do. In a different sutta, the Tevijja Sutta, the Buddha is approached by a couple of Brahmins who recommend a path to salvation that involves unity with this Brahma, this god Brahma. And the Buddha questions them. He basically criticizes them because he asks them if they have ever met this Brahma, if they know about anything about him personally. And they say they haven't met him, they don't know anything about him personally. And then he asks if their teachers have, and they say no. And then he asks if their teachers have, and so on, back many, many generations. And the answer is no. None of them have met this Brahma personally or know anything about him personally. And so part of the question is how they can recommend union with this being that they've never met. And the Buddha gives a number of parables. He says this is like the blind leading the blind. He also says that this is like searching for a woman for marriage just based on the description that you want the most beautiful woman in the country. You're going to have a hard time finding such a person. Or he describes a case of somebody wanting to build a staircase at a crossroads up to a house without knowing what direction the house is to be built in.
Well, I could draw a parallel here because when we ask Christians, when we ask theists, describe your God, they all more or less say exactly the same thing. The omnis, the God of the omnis, a conscious mind, one that has a will, one that can do anything, and there's really not much of substance there in terms of a description. So in a way it's sort of the same with this Brahma. They've got no sort of personal knowledge. They've never seen this God, they've never spoken to him, they don't really seem to know anything about this God. So it's kind of similar to when you ask Christians, describe your God.
How tall it is, and so on and so forth. So basically in all these situations, what he's saying is, if you're trying to direct a path towards something, you better know that thing. And if you don't know where you're going, then you'll look like a fool, basically, because you're not going to get there.
Okay, well, how do you know Brahma? Although, to be honest with you, that is sort of stepping outside of the scope of this video, which I thought was going to be purely asking the question, is Buddhism an atheistic religion? He seems to be preaching a little bit here.
Or you're going to construct something that's going to be useless to your eventual purpose. They discuss further, what are the qualities of this god Brahma? Because obviously the Brahmins do know qualities, supposed qualities of this god. The god.
Well, that's strange because he already asked them, do you know any of the qualities? Can you describe this God? Have you met this God? Have you got any experience of this God? And they've said, no, we don't know anything about this God at all, personally. And now he's asking them what the qualities of this God are. If they don't know anything personally about the God, how can they know what the qualities of the God are?
God is without a spouse. The God is without possessions. The God is without ill will, without hatred, so on. But the Buddha.
How do they know all this? Where did they get this information?
Buddha notes the followers of this god Brahma, the priests and so on, are themselves beings with spouses. They're married. They're beings who have possessions. They have houses. They've got wealth. They're beings who display hatred and ill will towards others. And so once again, the question is, how do these people expect to attain union with this being, this Brahman, if they're so different? If they're so different from Brahma to begin with? How do they even know about him very well? And in a kind of sub.
And I'd like to ask the question, again, this is moving outside of the scope of it, but how can one attain to union with this Brahma God? What is the process, or what is the reality of that? Where's the evidence that anybody has ever achieved union with this Brahma God? It hasn't even been established that this God exists.
Substitute, the Buddha says, instead of seeking union with Brahma by searching for something you really don't know about, and by beginning from a place that is so different from Brahma, why don't you try to make yourself more like this ideal of yours by...
Okay, this is definitely getting preachy. I'm going to move on and see if I can find anything of any more substance.
In the texts is as a teacher of gods and humans. And why is that? That's because very, very often in the texts, the Buddha is described as teaching gods. That the Buddha will have gods as his pupils, as almost as much, not quite, not as much, but very often. So it's almost as much as the people, as much as his own monastic followers. So what are we...
Well, if gods can be taught by men or a man, then they're not the kind of gods that we traditionally conceive of. So if gods are just some kind of, I don't know, super being, but much less than being all powerful and all knowing, etc., 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 then personally as an atheist, if there's a claim that this type of God is in any way supernatural, then I would have to say that I would need some evidence for these gods, in the same way that I would need evidence for the existence of the God of classical theism. It wouldn't really make any difference. These seem to me like much lesser gods, but nevertheless still gods if they're supernatural.
To make of this kind of apparent contradiction, where on the one hand he's criticizing the notion of gods, but on the other hand he's apparently teaching gods, and so these gods must exist in his world as he sees it. And the answer, I think, is quite simple, that the Buddha was...
And if they are gods and they need teaching, of what use are they? What's the point in a god that needs to be taught by a man?
As he sees it. And the answer, I think, is quite simple, that the Buddha was an atheist about an everlasting or all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good kind of God. He was an atheist about a God that was perfect, that was unchanging, the kind of God, frankly, of Western theology. Indeed, belief in this kind of a God is one of the wrong views listed in the Brahmajala Sutta, which is a very famous sutta at the beginning of the Digha Nikaya that lists a bunch of wrong views. But the Buddha did not disbelieve in supernatural beings generally. Indeed.
Now that's the important thing. That's what I'm really interested in, that Buddha, from the accounts here, seem to have believed in something supernatural, some supernatural beings that he called gods. Why? On what evidence?
Belief in supernatural beings is pretty common. Basically, it's universal in a pre-modern world. They believe that there were these kinds of supernatural beings around, but in the Buddha's picture, they were not all-powerful, not all-knowing, and not all good. And neither were they eternally existing or everlasting.
Doesn't make any difference. If they're supernatural, and you can't demonstrate that they exist, then for me, it's not really too much different on the claim that the God of classical theism exists. The only difference I would say is that if the Christian God exists and there's a heaven and a hell, it's going to affect me. But if any other kind of God exists, more or less, a deistic God perhaps, it's not really going to have any effect upon me if it exists or not. But nevertheless, I still don't see any good reason to believe in any of these gods, lesser gods or supreme gods, without some kind of evidence.
They lived and died. They were born, they lived for a time, and then they died. And so they were basically like superhumans. Rather than...
In what sense are they superhumans? They know so little that they need to be taught by Buddha. They live and they die. In what sense are they gods? How are they super beings? What do they actually do that's so super?
gods, very powerful beings, but beings that were relevantly like humans in all the important respects. And in the same way that they were beings that were like humans in all relevant respects, they were also not important to Buddhist practice or to the achievement of the final goal in Buddhism of awakening.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're important or not. If you believe in supernatural entities, you better have some good evidence to support that belief. Otherwise, you're being irrational.
The existence of these beings is just irrelevant, really. They could exist or not exist as far as the Buddha Dharma is
Then why bother having them? If they're irrelevant, why bother believing in supernatural entities?
concerned. And the aspect of practice within a, should we say, religious or philosophical context in early Buddhism, these beings exist, but they're not seen as relevant. Now, in later Buddhism, we get some more sophisticated kinds of atheistic arguments. For example, the great Buddhist scholar and philosopher Vasubandhu gave a couple of arguments, one about asking how it is that the multiplicity of the world could be understood as stemming from the unity of God, and another argument wondering about why a perfect being such as God would need to create anything at all. But these kinds of sophisticated theological arguments we don't find in the earliest Nikaya texts, probably because the Buddha wasn't really interested in those kinds of very sophisticated arguments. What he was interested in was more down-to-earth kinds of issues about whether it was really useful to you to think that God was responsible for everything around you. Also in later Buddhism, particularly in elements of the Mahayana form of Buddhism, we get what's called Buddha nature, a belief in Buddha nature. And this is something that begins to approach a kind of theology where there's the idea that although the Buddha himself has passed away, nevertheless there is a kind of Buddha nature, dharmic nature of the Buddha that underlies all of reality. And that
Okay, that's a claim. I want your evidence for that. What's your evidence that there's a Buddha nature which somehow is the essence of all reality? Where is your evidence for that? And what do you mean by Buddha nature? You haven't explained yourself and you haven't provided any evidence for it. It's just a belief in the same way as believing that Jesus is the Son of God, is the Savior of mankind. Unsupportable, unsupported.
In some sense is responsible for certain aspects of reality and that can be petitioned or prayed to in a sense, asked to do things.
Well, then it must be an agent. If it can be prayed to and petitioned, this Buddha nature must be an agent. It's now starting to sound more like the God of classical theism, if you can pray to it.
And so in later Buddhism, there grows up a kind of devotional Buddhism, a religious Buddhism, oriented around this kind of Buddha nature. Now, the subject of Buddha nature is very complicated, and certainly much too complicated for me to get into here. But let's just say that there are aspects of it that begin to resemble something like a God in a Western sense, maybe a deep...
Well, it may be complicated, but what reasons have you got to believe that it's true? There are some very, very complicated conjectures and speculations, very, very complicated, but it being complicated doesn't make any of it true.
Deist God, a God that is perhaps non-personal.
Well, if it's a deistic God and it's non-personal, how could you petition it and how could you pray to it? He's sort of contradicting himself.
But is anyway some kind of a principle behind all things that is in some sense responsible for them and that can be petitioned.
Yeah, but again, if we're talking about responsibility for this Buddha nature, then it sort of suggests that it is a personal agent.
In early Buddhism, we really don't find that. What we find, as I say, instead is a mix of ridiculing certain ideas of God, of denying that the belief in God is useful to our practice and daily life, along with a kind of belief in supernatural beings, which we nowadays can discard, and which indeed in the early context was really not...
Okay, so we see where he's coming from now, because he calls himself a secular Buddhist. He's saying that nowadays we can discard all the supernatural beliefs. What, all of them? What about this Buddha nature? As the essence of existence. What about that? That's a supernatural belief, right? Is he going to discard that as well as the supernatural lesser gods?
Relevant to any real aspect of their practice. So if you're interested in helping to create a wiser, a kinder, and a less stressed out world, please do consider subscribing to this.
That's amazing how he went from talking about is Buddhism an atheist religion And then he just concluded by saying, if you want to make the world a better place, please subscribe to my channel. How did he go from that? He made it sound like a conclusion. Okay, well, that's enough. From what he said, I'm not impressed with Buddhism. It seems to me, I thought that Buddhism was an atheistic religion. I was wrong. It seems to me that it's a bit more complex than that, that they have got beliefs every bit as much, that they can't support them in the same way that Christians can't support their beliefs properly with real empirical evidence. So not impressed so far with Buddhism. It seems to me just as unnecessary as Christianity and all the other religions. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you thought of that. I guess I'll have plenty of Buddhists leaving comments on my channel saying, you don't understand Buddhism. Okay, well, I'm not claiming that I understand Buddhism to any extent. I understand it a bit better now, perhaps. I've got a very rudimentary understanding. But all that interests me is not understanding the religion in its entirety. What interests me are the claims. And the claims that have been made in this video haven't been supported with any evidence. And I've got no reason to believe in any of them. Okay, thanks very much for watching. Bye for now. Oh, sorry. And I don't think he's got any reason to believe in them either, or any Buddhist in history has got any reason to believe in them, based on the evidence or lack of evidence that has been presented. Bye for now.